Hey, Jonathan. Good to have you here. Hey, everyone. This is Anil. I'm a CEO and co-founder of Multidots, Multicollab, and Dot Store. And today I have Jonathan with me, who is a CEO of Guildenberg. Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Anil. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So you just got back from WordCamp Europe.
Yes.
How was it? What were the highlights?
It was great. It was my first time in Athens. So it was, I love WordCamps in general. One of the things that it's hard to do, but I try not to schedule much of anything while I'm at a WordCamp because there's just so much to do, so much to see. One of the things I enjoy doing is just going around at WordCamp and bumping into people that often either maybe you've seen them recently or maybe you haven't seen them in a long time. So I think that's the major highlight for me, is just so many great folks in the WordPress community, and importantly, a lot of new faces, a lot of people coming in who haven't been to WordCamps before. I saw a number of folks, it was their very first time. So many highlights to choose from, but just seeing people in the community, seeing the community grow. Great venue, lots of excellent food. I got the privilege of being taken around by some locals, and yeah, it was excellent. I highly recommend it. I'm looking forward to WordCamp Europe in Italy next year.
Oh, I was going to ask, I had two actually questions related to WordCamp Europe. One was like, where is the next WordCamp? And the second was, what was the center of the discussion? Like, what was where it was aligned, the whole discussion of the WordCamp Europe? Not discussion, like focus.
Yeah, so the next one, so it's in early June. Early to mid-June is somewhere there. So that's when it is each year.
Okay.
I'm not aware of there being a theme. That would be, it'd be interesting for there to be an overall theme, but I think there were 5 different tracks. I did a panel on partnerships that I led. But yeah, there's a lot of different things going on. I'd love to see some more thematic focuses, but I'm not aware that there was a theme. And if there was, it wasn't clear to me.
Makes sense. Okay. So one question, Jonathan, I wanted to ask is that a lot of time what happens is, I'm sure like you, a lot of people know you, especially in the WordPress community, and they are familiar with you, the work that you have been doing. The one thing that I always ask and I'm always curious about, that where did you start it? So if you can tell like a little bit about what was your first job and where did you get started?
I'll focus on where I got the first started part in WordPress, because it's been about 18 years for me of effectively full-time in the WordPress space, and which is a long time for me. I'm coming up on, I think next year will be about like half my life will have been spent in WordPress.
Ooh.
And I'd always been interested in the web. Like as a young teenager, I've been building stuff online. I've been involved in community at like 13. I was part of some communities online in my 15s and 16s. I started to get involved in young entrepreneur groups, and it was around 18 or so that I discovered like WordPress for the first time. And I'd been helping. I was doing an internship, and I helped someone get a WordPress up and running. And I ran into some issues because there was an existing site. I was trying to bring WordPress into it to run just the blog portion, and I wanted to integrate it so it all looked the same. And I went on the .org forums and posted, and like got some unhelpful responses, some really helpful. Matt Mullenweg was one of the people who chimed in, and we were running WordPress. I think this was 1.5 at the time.
Okay.
1.2 or 1.5. I don't remember which one we were focused on. And they helped me get it done. And then at the end of it, I just had this idea. I don't know where it came from. I was like, I should like write a tutorial about this. And at the time, I had no intentions of it. Like, I didn't think people would really care about it. It was a way for me to kind of document the process and sort of finish it out. So I wrote a tutorial on how to integrate WordPress into an existing website. This was for WordPress 1.5. It's coming back to me now.
Wow. And
so I wrote this tutorial on my personal site. And then I dropped the link at the end of that post as like a thank you. Like, hey, thanks. If anyone's interested, I wrote it here. I didn't think anything of it. And then just sort of went my way. A couple months later, I got to get the first email where someone's like, "Hey, read the tutorial. Could you help us do this?" And I was like, sure. I wasn't like, look, I was at that point. I was like, I'm going to be a real estate investing entrepreneur. I'm going to like do all these things. Like tech was something that I was like interested in, but like that wasn't a real career. Like these are just things that I wasn't thinking at the time, right? I was just open and curious. I was exploring the world. And I was like, well, I could use some money. And they offered to pay me. And I think, I don't know, it was like $300-400 was the first like site that I did. I did the integration, and then it just kept coming. And over the next couple of years, I got a steady. So I went ahead and started writing a few more tutorials where I just did even more. And my idea with this, because I had a few folks at the time who were like, "Oh, you should charge for that. Like make people pay for that." I'm like, "No, I don't want to. I'm gonna give them everything that they need to do this." And I think, and my bet was that a couple of things would happen. Most people would not say anything ever. A few people would thank me for it. And every now and then someone would say, "You know what? This is clearly the guy who knows how to do this. Let's just ask him if he'll do it." So I just added a little note at the bottom. "Hey, if you want help, reach out and contact me." Over the next few years, I did hundreds of those projects.
Ooh, wow.
Because right time, right place, right? I was pretty lucky. For a long time, if you search for WordPress integration or like add WordPress to an existing site, it was my tutorials that were coming up at the top.
I was going to ask, do you have the link of your first tutorial that you wrote?
Yeah, it's still there.
Yeah, I would love to actually mention that in the show note.
Sure, I'm happy to drop a link afterwards. It's
cool.
It's a good time. And yeah, people from all over. I think you might have to check archive.org actually, but we'll find it. It's there. And people would contact me from around the world, and it was incredible because what would happen, I would get 2 to 3 leads a week. And because it was steady, I felt this freedom to experiment. And so I would do things like, and this is, so as an entrepreneur, this was like starting to kick in where like, this was all over email. I'd rarely ever talk to anybody. Like this was asynchronous, like remote work far before it was cool. Right. But I was working with people all around the world, universities, nonprofits, government, large businesses, small businesses. And because WordPress was the thing that they all had in common, they wanted to like get this up and running. And I would experiment. I'd send, I would like prepare an email with a price, and then I'd be like, you know what, let's try something different. I would double the price, and then I'd send it. Okay. When Gmail first introduced the undo feature way back in the day, I would use that where I would send it, I'd press undo, change the price, send it again, and people kept accepting. And so I'm like trying all these different things where I felt a freedom to experiment and like try new things. And yeah, hundreds and hundreds of projects later, I started to get to the point where I was beginning to be bored with it. And I wanted more of a challenge. I started to do enterprise work. So at this point, a couple of larger organizations had reached out to me, and that started to get me thinking about, ooh, this is new. These are some new challenges. And yeah, I think that's where my career sort of started to take off. And it wasn't too long after that I got my first job, which was working at a large agency called XWP. I was the first outside person to the team. And yeah, I did that for about 5 years, and that was much happened from there, but that was the opening of my sort of career into WordPress.
And you are still writing, and I really admire. I read some of your posts that you have written on ecosystem plugin and some other aspect of WordPress business and the product, and I found it actually very insightful. Like I think especially your ecosystem plugin, when I read that piece first time, and I think that's where I reached out to you, and we started discussing about that how we can leverage this ecosystem plugin framework for Multicollab. And I'm glad actually we had that conversation, because after that discussion and working with you on the ecosystem path, I think, me and my team, we all feel much more excited about, making this happen. And I think earlier in the beginning, specifically, we were more like, oh, we are building a plugin, and it's going to be a WordPress product business or a plugin, stuff like that. But since we learned the concept of ecosystem plugin, I think it changed, our focus, our energy. And yeah, so thanks to you and for suggesting that. Do you want to talk a little bit about the ecosystem plugin?
Yeah, let me talk about the origin of it, like where this concept came from. So I had worked at XWP for about 5 years and lots of enterprise experience, worked on at the time some of the largest WordPress projects that had ever been done, working with publishers, lots of experience and just pushing the edges of things, started working with Google. And at that point, I'd already begun thinking a lot more about WordPress from an ecosystem lens, like asking bigger questions, like, okay, where is this going? Like, what's the, like just starting to think more about this idea of WordPress as an operating system and just following my curiosity, really, right? Like at this point, I had over a decade of context and I was just asking more and more questions and wanted to just understand more about like how the space works. I was doing some brainstorming one day. Some of my best thinking is in the shower. And I was just thinking through like, okay, what are the different types of plugins? And it was like, okay, well, there's your feature plugins. That's what kind of we know most often. And then you have integrations. And I was starting to see a lot more of that. Like the world of SaaS was coming into WordPress where you have this integration point that could look like different things. And then I was like, but there's something else here that just doesn't quite fit. Like, what about these bigger ones? Like, and that's where the concept of an ecosystem within a plugin first came to me. And then what happened next is over the course of a few months, I just began to do research and sort of take all the inputs that I had so far and begin to categorize it and break it down and just ask more questions about it. And so what I settled on as a definition then that's held up well for me today is that an ecosystem plugin has what I would describe as 3 sort of key characteristics. First is that it introduces a suite of functionality for a specific audience. So it's not just like a thing that does one thing. It's like a whole suite of functionality, right? It provides an integration layer for third parties that serves the same audience. So it's like, here's your initial suite of functionalities, and here's a way that additional like developers can bring more functionality to the suite that's related, right? And then, and this is the step that most miss, is that the business behind it, or the organization, the team behind the plugin, recognize that it's an ecosystem and they work to influence and shape it over time. Because and if you just kind of take a step backwards through that, WooCommerce is a great example of an ecosystem plugin. And I had the privilege of working at WooCommerce for 18 months, a couple years back. And so got a good dose of that firsthand. WooCommerce introduces a suite of commerce-related functionality, be it add products, like manage them, sort of all these things for a given audience, which is anyone who's wanted to do commerce online, right? They also provide, to varying degrees of success, but it's there, a clear sort of path for third parties to create integrations and extensions for WooCommerce. So that's the sort of second check. And then WooCommerce, the business, works actively to shape and influence their ecosystem. They create programs, they have a marketplace. And so I think it's a good example from a number of perspectives. And I think why this began to matter for me is that
one question, Jonathan, I have is like, what are the other examples of ecosystem plugin in WordPress community and outside WordPress community?
Yeah, other examples. So I'll focus on just WordPress. I mean, to answer your question for the outside, like a SaaS, most SaaSes that are sort of well built are an ecosystem within themselves because they'll provide integrations, they'll manage it, etc. And I think part of what I'm guiding people to do is recognize that if it's not just a feature, if you have those characteristics, it is an ecosystem within itself. So good other examples: Elementor ecosystem plugin, right? Like it provides a suite of functionality, the site building, the management. It has a whole integration layer. They work actively to sort of take care of and grow their ecosystem. A lot of form builders are also ecosystem plugins, or at least have the characteristics. So Gravity Forms and Ninja Forms, whether they recognize it or not, or like act on it, they've got the characteristics. This is the gap I usually see, is that within WordPress, at least, they'll have the first 2 characteristics, but they don't necessarily recognize that it's an ecosystem, and so they're missing out on both monetizing it more effectively, and on sort of curating and guiding its growth. So builders tend to have the right characteristics, form plugins, commerce focused plugins. There's a number of others. Yeah, we're happy to get into more if you're curious.
No, that sounds good. So I interrupted you. You were sharing something about ecosystem that I asked you this question.
Yeah, no, I think it was just that point of like what I've noticed in WordPress. We're still fairly young as an ecosystem as a whole. And it's not uncommon for me to see a plugin with a large install base that has some of the characteristics of being an ecosystem plugin, but they're not really embracing it. They don't recognize it. And so they tend to, it hinders a lot of growth. And this harks back on some of the conversations that we first had about Multicollab, right? It's like your strategic choice of, do you want to focus on just providing a feature, or are you going to like create it in such a way that sets the stage for others to build on it, which is just very different ways of thinking about it, right? And there's benefits and trade-offs. Like, I'm not advocating that an ecosystem plugin is like necessarily the best path. It in general is a lot more work. There's a lot more involved in doing it properly. And not every like plugin, like, it's not a, you're setting up a whole ecosystem, which has lots of benefits and trade-offs. But in general, there's a lot of value to be created within the context of a strong, healthy ecosystem. It's generally a highly desirable thing, especially for an entrepreneur. And it's, but I think folks either don't recognize that they're on the way there, or if they're trying to go that direction, they, I don't know, it can be easy to miss some of the basic things just along the way.
All right, so let's talk about this process of deciding, especially if someone is at the stage where they just have a brand new idea about creating a new plugin, or they already have a plugin or an idea that's kind of like they're working on and it's already out there. How would you suggest or help, in terms of the questioning prompt or thought experiment to decide, the entrepreneur can decide whether I should go on ecosystem plugin route or I should just go on a feature plugin route? Because this was a question like when we were working with you and when you're helping Multicollab strategy, helping us with Multicollab strategy. I ponder on that question of like, all right, it's a decision time. You gave me that homework, and I wanted to kind of like bring in that because, a lot of people who are at that stage, how they can decide, or how we can help them to make this decision to whether it's a ecosystem plugin is a right choice or not for them.
So here's the thing, at least as I think about it now, I'm looking at this more from the entrepreneur's lens. So in general, an ecosystem plugin as a concept and in reality, well executed, is worth a lot more, right? But it's also a lot more work to get there. And one of the common examples,
more effort with better results too. Like
but also more risk involved. One of the common mistakes, I was talking to a couple the other day. They were building a plugin in the WordPress space, and it's a lot easier to build. And they're at a little bit of this decision point. It's a lot easier to build something for an existing ecosystem because it's a known sort of quantity, right? And like, if you wanted to build something for WooCommerce, for instance, there are established rules. There's like, you still have to think through like go to market and like, how do you do all that? Because we're a decentralized ecosystem. Building something for WordPress is no guarantee that people will find it, right? Like there's a lot of things you have to think through there. But if you're going into an existing sub ecosystem like WooCommerce, Elementor, Ninja Forms, etc., there's a path to being able to have your product be monetized and get distribution, etc. If you're creating your own, like you have to figure all that stuff out. Ideally, you do it through partnerships, etc. But like you're creating an ecosystem, and if you're doing that right, it's something that at its very best, you're going to end up guiding and sort of caretaking, but it's going to have a life of its own. And so a lot of your focus as an entrepreneur is how do you start it in the right direction? And that's a whole body of work. There's a lot to it that the value's there. And in general, that's where I would guide people if they want to like create a lot of value in this space. But there's also a lot of reasons why it's like, no, it's better to just build into an existing ecosystem, right? Like, and this is the challenge. If you say, oh, I want to create a new ecosystem plugin within WordPress, and it's going to have this suite of functionality, we'll have the integration layer and all this. So you'll pick an audience who that's for. And let's say you're going to be like, go for something big and say, my audience is small businesses. You're going to have a lot of work in getting distribution for that and getting that in front. There's a number of ways that you can pull it off, but you have to get the audience.
Yeah.
And a successful ecosystem plugin is one that has the audience. That's why it works. So that ends up becoming the key thing. How do you get the audience? If you can get access to an audience, then either you're getting access to that audience through another ecosystem, in which case you're just playing by their rules and you're maximizing it. So this is the case if you were building in Shopify. Shopify has their own ecosystem. WooCommerce has its own ecosystem. Benefits and trade-offs, different natures. One's centralized, one's decentralized. Ninja Forms has its own ecosystem. Elementor has its own. These are like more nascent. They don't have all the programs and things worked out. But there's a path to doing it. If you're going to create your own new thing, you need to have some strengths that you're leveraging, I'd recommend, or it's going to be just a very long process. Like you're going to have to find ways to get the audience. Right. So I think that's a key decision point first is like, what do we have going for us already? And if someone just starts from scratch and says, I want to create a new ecosystem plugin, then I'm like, well, you're going to have something pretty compelling. That's going to become why, because like from my point of view, until you can break at probably at least 500,000 installs,
right?
Unless you're quite specialized in a particular niche, like you need to have a path towards ubiquity. And a lot of folks like won't have that unless they have some way of getting distribution.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And one thing that helped me when you give me that homework of like deciding, which path we want to go. I think one thing that while I was thinking about the path forward for Multicollab, there are a couple of things that I put it on the paper in order as a decision factor. I think one was that when I look into the problem that we are trying to solve with Multicollab, it's a very big problem. It's not just like one little thing that you do and it will just help you do things differently. But I think it's basically taking over the entire publishing workflow. Yeah. And the whole editorial experience, like when you're creating, because I think that's where the heart of the WordPress is, where people spend the time. So that was it's like, this is, I mean, we have built multiple different plugins with Dot Store, which is kind of our other brand where we have built a bunch of different plugins. But Multicollab in particular with Multicollab, we are trying to solve a very big problem. And when I was thinking about the future roadmap, like what are all those things that what people who start using Multicollab will need those features. And I had a long list of things, it's like there are so many different things that can helpful, and can be built. And that's where I think that was a one big factor for me is like, I don't want to spend time and energy building all those features because we'll be so slow. Instead, we'll just build this essential foundation that enables the collaboration in the WordPress. And then, and that, it's actually very true, specifically for the WordPress, because WordPress, you and I, we both have seen that WordPress is very unique to each individual. Like, right? So all like small bloggers to small businesses to enterprise, they all use the WordPress very differently. The configuration is different. Their setup is different. Plugins they use, the way they have actually customized the WordPress is different. So it's very hard to kind of like creating a solution that pretty much works for all the WordPress setup. And that's where I think if I like the concept of ecosystem plugin, because that will help us to think more from the way where, like, how we can open up, create the foundation that is people can extend on it and build extension on top of that.
Yours, Multicollab, is especially interesting as a concept in theory, because if you're successful, which is the intention, right? Like it's something that is a paradigm shift. It's not for everyone in WordPress, because there are still plenty of people who will just do solo. But WordPress is increasingly becoming like collaborative.
Yeah.
And if you're successful in the play, we've talked about this, but there's a couple different things. There's one, as you're alluding to now, an entire world of like extendable, like ways that you can expand on that core function, right? That if you were to try as one organization to do it all, you're gonna slow things down. Like it's just not possible, versus saying, hey, we're going to build the core functionality. This is WordPress itself does this. And for everyone who cares about like synchronous collaboration, then, and just collaboration in general, just that whole multi-collaborative workflows, like this is like that next step up. In the same way that anyone who cares about commerce, right? Not everyone uses WordPress for commerce, but within that realm, you're going to have options available to you. So it has massive potential. Execution matters. And then part of what's also interesting about this is, how do you relate to the parts that do and don't end up part of core? I think any good ecosystem plugin needs to give serious consideration to how they relate to core. And that's something that, like, to me, because WordPress itself will always have, I would argue, this like root, like publishing centric flow, which is individual based. It's like there will be aspects of collaboration that would end up just becoming an essential part of core in the future. Like we expected, it's on the roadmap, but there's going to be a whole suite of functionality that really isn't relevant until you except for a subset of folks. And that's where there's a lot of opportunity, but it's ambitious. And it's also something that requires long-term thinking. And anyway, that's what I've seen in in the work that you guys have been doing, the tracks in the background, your own approach as a leader. You're very thoughtful about things. And so in my assessing, I'm like, yeah, I can see that that you guys have a really good shot at pulling this off. You just need the right strategy and approach. And I feel like you've been figuring that out.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah. Thanks for specifically like showing us that path. Like, okay, there is also another way to grow a product business, which is, so I think when I read your blog about it, and then when we started working with you, I think that was very helpful and clear. Awesome. So anything else you wanted to cover about the ecosystem plugin, or anything that you do with the Guildenberg before we move on to more like a fun conversation?
This is all fun. What I would say, I think one of the things I love about our community is just the open source nature of this, right? Like I care a lot about WordPress, and I care about WordPress because of where it sits and how it relates to the broader open web. Like I like the proprietary platforms. I think it's great that Shopify and others exist. I personally want a strong, healthy, open web. And to me, for that to be the case, WordPress, like I want to see it continue to do well, and I want to see people build healthy ecosystems within WordPress. So I really appreciate you bringing the topic up. I appreciate the work that you guys are doing. And for anyone who's curious, there's lots of great resources out there. My pieces are available. I always love talking about these things. People are always welcome to ask questions. And this is when I'm introducing someone new to the WordPress community, it's conversations like this and what I'm describing, this openness that can surprise people at first. But what is missed, like it's not, yes, I genuinely enjoy this. It's not altruism though, because at the end of the day, because WordPress is open source, you and I both own WordPress. Anyone who uses it is part of this ecosystem as a whole. And so when you succeed, it's also helping me succeed. And so there's this aligned incentive inherent in WordPress's success. There are a lot of trade-offs of our decentralized nature as an ecosystem. And you're starting to see this now. We're growing like crazy. WordPress is a bit of a hot mess from a product perspective. There's so many options. It's becoming harder and harder to have solutions. People like it's taken a lot to get stuff up and running in WordPress. That doesn't need to be the case. And I think ecosystem plugins are great opportunities to become much more and more solution centric for the audiences that you serve. So something I want to encourage. And yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there. I also think we're still early. There are, as of today, about a little over 92 million active WordPress installs across the web. That's a big opportunity.
Wow. Yeah.
It's going to continue to grow. This is data from Web Pros, so they're they're the cPanel and Plus guys. So they have a good bird's eye view of sort of what's happening across the space, and there's a lot of opportunity there. And yeah, I think I'm looking forward to seeing a lot more entrepreneurs get involved. And as an open source ecosystem, I think there's opportunity for that growth to be done in what I would describe as like the WordPress way, where it's just it's different stakes, right? Like there's something about doing things in the open and collaboratively, and the vibe that you get from WordCamps where I don't know, I'm a little you perhaps have been exposed to it too, but there's quite the like hustle culture out there with startups, and where it's like, oh, you got to like always have to be rushing and like doing this and doing that. And like, I don't know, that's fine. I respect it. And there's room for that. You can bring that into WordPress too. But from my perspective, it's not necessary. And I like taking a longer term view to things. And I'm looking ahead to the next 10 years in WordPress, and I expect it to be more relevant than ever then, but not just by default, but because people like you and I and all those around us continue to bring our best to it. So I'm looking forward to what happens next.
Yeah, me too. And I think one thing I wanted to add about what you mentioned about the open ecosystem versus like closed ecosystem. And I have also experienced that specifically like before we started focusing more on the WordPress based, like our business focusing more on the WordPress, we were kind of like doing a bunch of different things. You know, we were into Microsoft like technologies and some other types of development consulting and all. And yeah, one thing I personally experienced as an entrepreneur that entering into WordPress ecosystem is much more easier and also warm and welcoming, you know, compared to the other community. It's like more open community, but also not just open as an open, but it's also more like helpful and letting you to come and build whatever you want to build. So yeah, anyone, you know, considering still like just doubling with whether I should go and focus on the WordPress or not, I think, yeah, hopefully this conversation will inspire them.
Yeah, and I would just anchor once more that it's not just because there are nice people in WordPress, but it's not just because of that. It's because of open source and this recognition that when someone succeeds in WordPress, like we in WordPress all benefit from it. And I see that like from my agency days, where agencies who would otherwise be and often were explicit competitors would collaborate because we recognized that by working together, we're making the space bigger for all of us. So that's yeah, the more the better.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so Jonathan, let's switch gears to talk about how do we manage stress and growth. So this is something that I personally experienced in my life, like growing a business is stressful. And there was a statistics that 30% of the entrepreneurs, especially in the America, they struggle with depression. And yeah, so that's something I wanted to talk as well, that how do you handle stress in your life and how do you balance the growth and you know, the whatever the cost of the growth is.
I started going to therapy for the first time about a year ago, and like meeting with a counselor and like focusing on mental health, which I highly recommend. And yeah, this is something that it's a struggle. Like I think it's important to ask yourself questions about what's your motivation, and over the past several years, I've seen this gradual, steady, and positive shift from, I've always been optimistic. I've realized in going through therapy that my optimism was actually more of a self-defense mechanism that I've had from my early years and some things I went through as a child. And so optimism is a very valuable trait as an entrepreneur in general, right? It's like, I believe this, and then you can sort of shift reality around you to match it up. And that's incredible. But there's also downsides to it, especially in the quieter moments when you're sort of left with your own thoughts and doubts and uncertainties about things. And over the past couple of years, I've seen this shift from when it comes to my motivations, from being like more fear driven, which is like, even though I wasn't conscious of it, a lot of my young motivations were fear driven. Like, if I don't do this, like, I wouldn't even let myself think about it. Like, I'll fail, like I'll be on my own, like I'll be alone. Like, those are things that would sort of drive. And even though it wasn't conscious, it was there. And at first, once I started leaving that as my motivation, I even worried for a bit of like, it's like my productivity went from here to here perceptibly because I was no longer being driven by like the fear.
Yeah.
And I wrestled with that for a bit. Like, I started to be afraid of that. Like, am I broken now? If I'm not like driven, if I'm not working like as crazy hard as I was before,
it becomes a strong part of your identity, right? And then you feel like you're losing it.
It does. I read a piece early this morning where my like 18-year-old self was writing about time management, and I was writing at the time as if I'd figured it out. Okay. That like I've now solved my time management problems, and it's going to be like this going forward. And it's something that I still care about and struggle with, but in a different way, and I'm much more peaceful about it now than I was then. But I couldn't see that at the time. I couldn't see how fear driven I was. If you asked me, I would know I'm not afraid. But deep down, there was this like, I got to do all this, or I'm going to like end up alone, like in some way, shape, or form, right? And so over the past few years, my motivations have slowly but surely shifted to like, no, I'm not afraid of that. What happens is what's going to happen. And what am I curious about? Where can I create and provide value in the world? Like, what's useful and interesting? And as an entrepreneur in particular, one of the benefits, because there's a lot of trade-offs, there's a lot of challenges of being an entrepreneur, but one of the benefits is freedom and autonomy and being able to choose sort of what you want to do and where you want to do it. And what I've struggled with, and even it's still there, it still pulls at me now and then, is this like, this guilt, like, oh, I have to do more. Like, I got to get more done. I can't like enjoy this. Yeah. And it's just not true. And what I find is that when I take time, whether it's being with a loved one, whether it's taking long walks, whether it's just being outside, stepping away from something, many of my best ideas come from that, from like, I was talking to my therapist the other day, and she's like, it's important for entrepreneurs, especially to allow themselves to be bored. Yeah. Like, to have time where it's like, you don't have to do a particular thing. And I've seen that over and over again, where it's in those moments that something will spark. I'll be curious about something. So that's a long-winded way of saying, when it comes to like managing stress, if I'm noticing myself feeling stressed, I'm learning to ask questions about, okay, where is this coming from? Why am I feeling this way right now? If it's conflict in a relationship, then it's a prompt for me to like ask myself first, like, what's going on? Like, why am I feeling this way? And then to work with the individual to express something. Like, I think the best relationships are those where you have this emotional safety. You can express, you can share with each other even whether in your personal life and the work life. And I think if you don't have that, then that's a thing to work on getting. Like, that's a basic thing that it's quite important to have. And if you have that, take care of it and grow it and expand it. And but yeah, the best solution that I've found is just to continue to be open and curious. And when something doesn't feel right, when something feels off, don't just make assumptions about why that is. Like, in the past, I'm like, oh, I just have to work harder to take care of this. Like, no, that's not the answer. Like, there's something else going on. and asking those questions, giving yourself the time and space to ask that, like, hey, why am I feeling this way right now? Like, why do I feel so stressed? It's okay to not have the answer. The answer may not be apparent. Like, it might be, for me, sometimes it's weeks, maybe months before, sometimes years before the answers to those questions come. But you ask them enough, the answers eventually show themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what I'm getting from what you said is importance of self-inquiry. So I think a lot of time what happens is, and that's something that personally I have observed that too, that we live in an autopilot mode. So most of the time, our life, our day, it's just going in an autopilot, and we do not integrate the rest and pause. And doing those rest pause, that's where I think you will have a time and space to do the self-inquiry.
Yes.
And also, specifically what you mentioned about that, those free time or the time where we allow ourselves away from the work, productivity, whatever, we are kind of hustling for, just away from it, and then spend time alone by ourselves, or, the people that we love. I think those are the moments where we get creative thoughts or ideas. And I think there is a research has been done. I read a book about it, and they say there are two kind of focus that we do. One is called hyperfocus. That is where we kind of like try to be more productive, deep work on a computer or whatever. Like, what we're trying to do is accomplishing a goal, an objective, or trying to get things done.
Yeah.
And that's our hyper focus mode, and which is good. We need to have a few couple hours every day where we allow ourselves to just focus on getting things done. But then there is this another kind of focus that we miss. It's called Scatterfocus. So the Scatterfocus is something when we allow ourselves, like shower, walk, nap, and not focusing on getting things done, but just allowing ourselves to wander. That is where, in that mode, that's called Scatterfocus. And in that Scatterfocus, all the ideas that you have been collecting throughout the day, that's where you connect those ideas. And those ideas, when the collection of ideas automatically start wiring and connecting into a creative solutions, and that is where you realize, like, that's where kind of you're allowing yourself to get out of the autopilot mode. And a lot of people, and especially me, like when I started my career, like I was working 14, 16 hours every day, and I did not have a time to do that scatter focus where I can have those creative ideas. But when I started to do it more, I realized that that's kind of itself is boosting my productivity to 10, 15x than me just focusing, doing the work all day.
It's counterintuitive. At least it seems counterintuitive at first. Like, by doing less, by taking more time off, you actually get more accomplished.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard it described that way. That makes a lot of sense. My own experience attests strongly to that. Even this basis for this discussion on ecosystem plugins was a direct result of many walks and showers and just like letting something percolate and being curious. And then at one point it's like, it's this, and it kind of crystallizes, but you have to give your brain space to wander and just like, hey, we don't have a thing that we have to solve right now. We don't know where this is going to go. And I find that pretty consistently, like that's my best work. It starts there, and then I can hyper focus to like get something done. Exactly. But I like that.
Yeah. Great. Do you read any books, Jonathan? And if there is any book that has a significant impact in your life?
Oh, man. So I love books. It's one of the things that I think just in general, as a person, books to me have some of the highest return on investment. So I keep multiple shelves of books that I haven't read yet. Once I'm done with books, I usually just move them on. So I do a decent amount of Audible these days. So I tend to have a few modes where I love it when the author reads. So like I'm working through Seth Godin's Song of Significance right now. And with Audible, I love getting the books where the author reads it. With physical books, they tend to be more reference and scanning, where like I'm interested in, I have books on like wide ranges of topics.
Yeah.
So if I had to pick, I think I'd need you to kind of limit my range a bit. Like I'm reading a bunch of different stuff at once.
All right. So let me ask you this.
Yes.
If there is one book that you recommend to WordPress entrepreneur, what would that come to mind?
I'm gonna, so I might have different answers, but I think where I would probably start is Seth Godin's This Is Marketing, because a lot of WordPress entrepreneurs, at least in my experience, have tended to be more like developer oriented and don't have this clear audience and problem set thing figured out. Right. Seth Godin does a great job of like a no nonsense, like value centric way to think about marketing that like I really enjoy. I think it's excellent work. And so I think that's probably where I'd start. Like if you get that, then you're on a good path to entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Versus I see a lot of people like build something cool, but it's like a solution in search of a problem. And maybe you get lucky, but that's not a good way to build a business from my perspective.
Yeah. This Is Marketing is a classic. I read it a long time ago, and you're right. Like I come from an engineering background, and the whole world of marketing is something that I had this very weird notion of it. But when I read that book, This Is Marketing, it helped me understand that what I'm missing right now, and what is something that I should learn about, what is actually marketing,
Yeah.
There is one book that I
please.
wanted to share. It's called, it's very hard to find the book, but it's called Pricing Creativity by Blair, Enns. And I don't think so we can find that on Amazon, but that book itself, it's called Pricing Creativity. We'll put it into the show notes as well. But I learned so much about how to price your product and services into an agency business, or like, when you're selling a digital services. And it's very interesting how, like, what I was missing. And especially, I think since last 4 years, we have been applying a lot of strategies and ideas that's suggested in that book for our service offerings.
Pricing Creativity is actually one of my favorite books as well. I had the privilege of working with Blair directly back in my agency days.
Okay.
So if I'm in the service world, that's like my favorite book. And what I'd add to folks, like, because most of what I do these days is focused on the product side of things. So product pricing, the product approach is quite different. However, one of the big opportunities I see for folks doing ecosystem plugins, et cetera, is to incorporate a like productized service component to it, or to think about the service side of things. And Pricing Creativity is that's fantastic. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's a great book.
I'm also glad that you read that book and you had a chance to work with Blair. So Jonathan, we are approaching close to wrapping this up. So I've two quick questions. One question is how people can find you and learn more about everything that you offer. So let's start there.
My WordPress site, jonathanwold.com, is the best place. You can go to the contact page. My number's there, email, all that. So that's my go-to.
Awesome. And we'll put this into our show notes as well. And my other question is, who do you think from the WordPress community that I should interview next for the series?
I'll give you two people. So Luke Carbis is one. Luke is fantastic. He's been in WordPress a long time, and he's had a lot of experience on the product side of things. We've worked together in multiple occasions. And Tammy Lister is the other that I'd recommend. Tammy has also been in WordPress a long time. She's got a design background. She brings like a wide range of thinking. She was heavily involved in Gutenberg early on, and she does some great writing. So just two people who do a lot of thinking about the space who I admire and respect. So I think they would be great guests.
Awesome. No, thanks for sharing. That was fun, Jonathan. And thanks for your time today and sharing everything about how to grow our product business, but also how to take care of ourselves in the times when we feel stressful. Anything you want to add before we close it down?
Thank you, Anil.
Thank you, Jonathan. You take care. Have a great rest of the week.